I now am incredibly honored to tee up the afternoon conversations a little bit. First, we're going to dig into community development and economic development as fundamental drivers for health and equity. And I'll start by sharing that we've really been on, as you've heard now, I think, gotten a sense of, we've been on a journey over the past few years to really listen and learn from folks that know this work so much better than us, to hear about the strengths and strategies in rural communities across the country and for advancing rural opportunity across the country. I have the privilege of working not just as a connector across the Foundation on rural things, but deeply in our Healthy Communities work, in a team that's really focused on creating the conditions in communities that advance social and economic well-being that lead to better health and well-being over time. We know that our neighborhoods and our communities have a profound impact on how healthy we are, how communities are designed and built, and the decisions that their residents and leaders make create the paths toward or away from health and opportunity. The basic conditions where we live, like affordable, safe housing, good public transportation, clean water, even broadband, are really important drivers and really make the difference in the opportunities that we get in quality education, good jobs, access to good quality health care, and our opportunity to connect with others, whether it's in our community or with others outside of our community. And those basic conditions really set us up for success and in turn influence the chances we have to be healthy and well. So we know also, and we've been hearing already all day, about rural leaders across the country that are doing really incredible, sustained work, really persistent work to fundamentally change what opportunity looks like in their own communities. And I've been incredibly privileged to be part of the folks at RWJF, to have the chance to learn from and connect with folks across the country doing this incredible work. So in this next panel session, we're really shifting the conversation, although I think we've already been hearing a lot about it over the course of the morning, but we're really going to take an intentional shift to focus on solutions for this afternoon. And to lead that panel discussion, I'm not seeing Dante. Are you here, Dante? Oh, now I see Dante. We're so pleased to have Dante here from the American Communities Project to serve as our moderator for the panel. So I welcome you all up.
Okay, here we go.
Am I on? I am on. That's great. This isn't a solo act, however. But I can start, I guess, when we do this, I'll start by talking here really quickly. So, hello, my name is Dante Chinni. I'm the director of the American Communities Project at George Washington University. But I'm also a journalist, so it's been nice to see my group get beat up on a little bit today. I created the American Communities Project actually because I am a journalist, and I traveled the country a lot, going to different kinds of communities, and the thing that really became clear to me was that we don't do a very good job in journalism of understanding the country. You go to different places, and then you end up writing about red America and blue America, or urban America and rural America. So I worked with an academic at Stanford, and we created this map that you see on the board. This is using 40 different demographic variables across all the counties in the country, more than 40 actually, to create 15 different types of community. So these are the 15 different types of place in the American Communities Project. We are currently right now, we have funding from Robert Wood Johnson, we are currently right now working on a report about
Well, who's starting?
the HRSA definition of rural to break them into the rural communities in the most rural types. And I think we have a map of what that looks like. This is the report we're doing on 8 different types of rural place in America. These are the most rural types that we have, and looking at the rural counties and the most rural types. And the thing that's really interesting when you do that and you look at the data is diversity comes out. The picture of rural America is much more complicated than most people think, and that's really what the point of our report is. We're getting at the differences in rural America that we miss when we think about what many people think about and what Sarah was just talking about, which is, I think, American Gothic, a farmer and his wife, and a cow in the background, and everybody's white. That's not the rural America that exists out there. Rural America is diverse economically, it's diverse racially, it's diverse ethnically, and these are the different types in the counties. This is the county level version of that map, what it looks like. This is what it looks like when you look at the 8 types we focused on. We can put that up, I think. One more slide? Nope. Okay. When we looked at it, then we're going to get going really quickly, but I've got a wonderful panel here to talk about rural America. When we look at these 8 different types of rural America, we're looking at places like aging farmlands, which is overwhelmingly white, agricultural, kind of the people's mind-eye vision of what rural America looks like. But also the African-American South down in the Delta. Hispanic centers out west and actually in the southwestern corner of Kansas, interestingly enough. Native American communities all scattered all throughout the country. Something we call rural middle America, and then Mormon communities out west in Utah. Anyway, that's our vision of rural America. The report will be coming out in the coming months. It's going to be heavy on data that's going to break all those things up, and then we visited 6 different communities in different states around the country to explore what that looks like. What we have here, though, on stage is a group of people that can really talk about rural America and the solutions in rural America and what's happening with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to start going across the stage and coming back to me with Lisa. Because of her work in finance in rural America, kind of giving us a view of the big picture. I mean, Lisa, you look at the challenges and the opportunities financially in rural America. What do you see when you look out there from the 30,000-foot view?
Thank you so much, Dante. And it's fun to be here and fun to think about the broad picture. And I like your map. It has more colors usually. You see it either in red and blue or in just red, meaning areas of high poverty. I have a vision on rural America that I've been privileged to work in rural America for over the last 30 years, starting at the Ford Foundation and then ending most recently at the Department of Agriculture in the Rural Development team. Many of the folks are here. I see Doug O'Brien and Tom Ferguson who were with me. But my sense is that it's been thrilling to hear so many presenters today give a more complex picture, including you just with that great map that you just did. But that the needs of if we're going to get to a healthy, thriving America, we're going to have to finance the kind of growth that is sustainable in our communities. And that's coming from a lot of places. In the area of the Department of Agriculture that I worked in, we had a $30 billion investment portfolio, most of it in housing. 24 million of that was in housing, and the next chunk in water, and the next chunk in business. And I say that just to say there are streams that exist. There's budgets that exist to do a lot of the financing. Where that breaks down is where the markets don't easily move in rural America, where our banking sectors, our state and local things break down. And that's where Ed CVAC started to talk about the tool of community development finance. Because you can have financing that is effective for many sectors of rural America that are functioning and high functioning. And where it starts to break down is anytime you're a little off market, where there is not easy collateral if you're starting a small business, or where you're moving out of major industries. And that's where we need the market partners. And especially when we come to the areas of the map that are
low-income, persistently poor areas. And that's where I like to think of the community finance, the community development financial system, as the healers of those markets and getting the finance where it won't easily flow, often in partnership with the very institutions that are more mainstream, government, private banking. It's not this isolated thing. It's that we, the community development financial institute, come in and finance solutions that are needed to get to that. A broadband term would be the last mile, the parts that don't easily finance. And so I think that's what's often missing in this. Yeah, I was thinking of my favorite medical analogy since I met Robert Wood Johnson. And I feel like I'm going around explaining to people that, penicillin works. And I'm kind of going around, and there's this old thing that everybody knows about that's sort of been effective for a better part of 100 years. And I'm a proselytizer saying, this would be a great thing, to. Yeah. And now I'll say this, and somebody will tell me there's new research that penicillin doesn't work. But I often feel that when I try to describe America's community development financial systems, we're 30 and 40 years old, yeah. And we're finally at a stage where it would work. We need to be supported and funded to work. But I often feel like I'm explaining something that's in place, that's ready to go, yeah. And that needs to flow freely. So
there's a stockpile of penicillin pills, but there's nobody to deliver the pills to the people who need the pills.
Or that the stockpile is a little stuck in some warehouses somewhere, and it needs to get out further. Right. Yeah,
it's like the last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? It's stacked up in the boxes. Chrystel, talk a little bit about what your more narrow focus getting into Native American communities around the country, and specifically the challenges and kind of the opportunities in those communities. What do you see day to day?
So first of all, it's so nice to be here. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Miigwech, Nina Nishnabe Kwe, Mikanakwajish, Gunagundunji, Mashkode Bijakia Kwe, Dijnakash. My name is Chrystel Cornelius, and I am the Executive Director of First Nations Oweesta. We are a intermediary Native CDFI, and we are the only intermediary Native CDFI working for the past 20 years, specifically looking at serving Native American communities and Native American financial institutions. And what's really innovative about that, just in and of itself, in 1999 there was 2 certified Native CDFIs. Today we have over 67, and my organization is working with 30 more to realize certification. And what that essentially means, in my language, reservation, the word for reservation is a shkunigan, and that translates in English into leftovers. So when you look at 573 tribes, we've got 67 of these financial institutions operating within these communities. One thing that is really interesting about Indian country per se, so we're talking about these 573 federally recognized tribal nations left in the United States, is generally we're all very remote, and we have been left out of the financial system from inception. So what's so interesting about the work that we're doing and the advent of CDFIs, for the first time we have afforded prudent and safe and affordable capital to Native communities, and we have changed the economic landscape of our communities. Most reservations and border towns you'll find are predominated by predatory lenders, and when you're looking at really integrating into a mainstream financial system, which CDFIs in at large, that's what we do. We serve the underserved, marginalized communities and unbankable communities. So I'll give just one kind of local level story and talk a little bit briefly about what we've been doing on a national level. I started the first nonprofit on my reservation in North Dakota in 2004, which was a CDFI. It was the first time that financial education had ever been taught in my community. First Nations Oweesta, my organization, we have the longest standing, curricularly, culturally appropriate financial education curriculum used within all of Indian country. We're now in our 5th edition. We've trained over 30,000 train-the-trainers to go down in our communities. And looking at cash economies, and a lot of rural America have lived in cash economies. So the opportunities that they've had for financial services, if there doesn't happen to be a bank or credit union, tend to be predatory type of lenders, which we all know working in this space is quite devastating to low-income families really trying to gain a financial footing for themselves and their families. I had a woman come in when I taught our financial literacy classes at home, and generally with all CDFIs, you have, part of being a CDFI is providing education in conjunction with financing services. So a lot of people that were coming into my door ultimately wanted a loan from my local nonprofit, either for consumer lending or to start a business. So a single mom came in. She had 4 children, and she was also taking care of her parents in a quintessential HUD home, which was 2-bedroom. She wasn't necessarily interested in a loan. She had a relatively well-paying job. She had a lot of people to support. She was just tired of living paycheck to paycheck. So within the 3-day course of providing these classes, I didn't see her in my office again. 3 years later, she stops me at a grocery store and she said, "Chrystel, you'd be so proud. I have $5,000 in a bank account now based on the classes and the skills that you taught me." So even being able to provide individuals the tools that they need to take control of their financial futures, this is what CDFIs do. This particularly is what CDFIs done in Native communities throughout the nation. We, as First Nations Oweesta, typically tend to be the first issuer of debt into these organizations with the hopes that we provide you this initial loan, which allows you to capitalize your target market needs, and you're able to gain additional investors to really support community development within reservation communities. One of the challenges we find, and within rural America, I think at large, is we tend to be outside of mainstream financial institutions' preview. We tend to be outside of a lot of foundations' footprints, so we're really looked at to solve a lot of these problems ourselves, which can be quite challenging when a lot of other organizations have opportunities for capital, which rural communities essentially don't. One of the challenges I find within Indian country, and a lot of this has to do with sovereignty and, basically a lack of knowledge within our communities, is the conception that Indian country is a risky bet. And, how do I really integrate into these communities? If I did want to help support, cultural difference, and the divides may be so great, what is sovereign immunity? What is this trust land? I mean, there seems to be so many barriers, which actually all have been mitigated, and we've shown incredible success, through 30 years of financing. My organization has revolved over $27 million in Indian country, and I've had 1 loan default. We outperform banks. I made that loan. It was a $10,000 loan about 4 years ago. My default rate is still 0.01%. So I think that ultimately can really show when you provide capital to communities that have been starved of capital, and you pair that in conjunction with development services and education, results can be astounding. We have built the financial fabric and changed economic landscapes throughout Indian country, but more importantly, we've really helped build private sector economy and build individual assets in regards to just people's own credit or being able to purchase a home and become true stakeholders in their community.
Yeah, and what you're really talking about is pent-up demand, ultimately, for capital, right? There's a need, there's a desire for capital, and it hasn't been able to work its way in until.
Last year, our native CDFIs, we do a lot of data collection as well, had an unmet need of $55 million alone, that being shovel-ready projects they were not able to accommodate for tribal members.
Yeah. And as I know, that's something that you know something about, dealing more, I guess, down in the Delta with the communities. You talk about persistent poverty counties, heavily based down in the South, and a little bit. What are the particular challenges that you see down there, and the hopes that you see down in those communities?
Great job. Ines Polonius, I'm the CEO with Communities Unlimited, and we all know Flint, Michigan. What we don't know is that Flint, Michigan is replicating itself over and over and over again in rural Louisiana, rural Texas, rural Arkansas, rural Mississippi, rural Alabama, and in the tribal lands of Oklahoma. And so we take a very broad and holistic approach to community economic development, looking at the infrastructure that's needed to enable economic development, and then working in community to build leadership teams that reflect the population. So this is a lot of times the first time that folks have actually worked across race, and then building practical leadership skills in those teams for them to design their own solutions. And that allows us to really help them identify the assets in their communities and move those assets toward a market opportunity, a quantifiable market opportunity that might be in a region, that might be in a metropolitan area, that might be global. What it really comes down to, and I think Sarah said it best in the previous session, I want to take what she said to more community development lingo. We have done so many needs assessments that we have convinced communities of their deficits, and we never talk to them about their assets. So when we first walk into a community, we really begin to look in a very structured framework, what are the assets here for us to work with? And it begins to shift mindsets, and it begins to create hope. So as the leadership team begins to work, we muscle in as many resources as we can to get them to solutions to help them build entrepreneurial ecosystems that allow them to build their economies from the inside out. There's a place for attraction, but not in the persistent poverty communities in which we work. And extraction, we know, especially from sitting where we are geographically here, is not a sustainable strategy for most rural places. And it's taking that approach, I want to say we're a community development financial institution plus. And I think Chrystel brought it out so well. It's not just about the capital and the unmet demand, it's also building the capacity of the community and the individual to take that capital, turn it into profits and cash flow to be able to repay that loan. And so we lend into the water wastewater space, we lend into individual entrepreneurs and some community facilities, and then we have a couple of other products that are really there to help support specific community needs. So I feel a little bit like I'm a placeholder for organizations that work like we do. And so I just want to highlight two things that the foundation has been very active in. And I want to have everybody who's part of the Persistent Poverty Working Group and our larger support network nationally, because some of you are here also, to just quickly raise their hands. And you, Lisa. So these are 6 community development financial institutions that all do predominantly lend into persistent poverty places. And we are trying to, one, elevate the voice of persistent poverty rural places because the needs are a little bit different than in other rural places. But then we have this amazing network of national partners that help us get a lot done on the policy level. The other group that I want to highlight, which is organizations that are rural development hubs, and there's a great brief outside from Aspen Community Strategies Group that has been asked by the foundation to really look at the role of intermediaries in this space. Intermediaries, and they have isolated 13 different characteristics that differentiates a rural organization from a rural development hub that really takes a holistic approach to putting all the pieces together and then allowing that community to co-create the strategy and implement it. So I just wanted to raise those 2 points.
Do you find, the one thing I'm curious, we talked a little bit this morning, the community we went to for this report, St. Francis County down in Arkansas, it is when you talk about having people work cross race and ethnic divides, I mean, is a problem in some of these communities that they don't view themselves as a whole, so they don't see what they have to offer as a community? I mean, it seemed that some of the places you go, that some places I've gone as we've done reporting for this report, that there's this group of people and there's this group of people, and so coming together on what do we have to offer is even difficult to do.
What we find a lot of times is you've got the white power in each of these communities, and then you have pretty well organized leaders of color. And the question for us always is, how can we create that bridge? How can we get them to understand that ultimately they want the same thing for their children, and to get them to work together? And this process takes a minute. It's not easy to get instant results. But a lot of times what we find is, as we identify leaders that have really creative ideas and we bring them to the table, they've never been in a position or have had the opportunity to lead. They've never had an opportunity to be in a room with other leaders and actually work together and work through implementation. So they have a lot of good ideas, and so a lot of our training is really focused around how do we create the bridge, but then also how do we create the leadership skills that are practical, that allow them to interact and gain some successes, which creates momentum, which then really moves them down a positive path.
That's fascinating. And rounding us out, Brian, kind of pulling back again to 30,000 feet or higher, to look at what's going on across rural America, and your focus, obviously, your interest is regional partnerships. But just to talk a little bit about, at the highest level, what you see as what's happening economically, financially in rural America, and maybe the commonalities. We focus a lot on how unique all these situations are, but the commonalities in some of these places and the challenges they face.
Well, I'll try. I got really annoyed last week, and I want to share my annoyance, which was yet another missive from the Metropolitan Program at Brookings Institution. The meat of that piece was that to help rural communities, we need to invest in the cities. And the effects of that investment will flow over into the rural communities, and all will be well. For after all, the rural communities are subsidized by the people who are doing well in the cities. That's the way it works. It isn't the way it works. And we've been talking about narrative this morning, and that, to me, from a pseudo-intellectual organization supposedly just to the left of center, is just, I find, unacceptable. So let me just take a pause and then talk about what I actually think is important, is that rural and urban America are interdependent. We need each other. The problem is that we have to better recognize what the contributions are that rural America makes to the whole. We grow food, we provide energy, we provide people, we provide the environment. We're going to be more and more important as we deal with climate change. But few of those things are actually monetized in a way which benefit rural people in terms of the type of jobs, how much they get paid, recognizing the stewardship of those resources. So, given that premise that rural, urban are interdependent, where I end up then is a discussion about how can urban and rural work together in a regional context in ways that rural are not supplicants at the table, but are equal partners with our urban counterparts, so that we can negotiate the resources and everything we need in order to meet the range of challenges that we have in front of us, and which have been well articulated today. So what do we need in order for that to happen? Because the future of every individual rural community, at least in my humble opinion, is going to be determined by the presence or access to resources, financial, technical, organizational, to be able to negotiate with external players, whether they're our metropolitan partners, whether they are the federal or state governments, whether they are corporations, public and private landowners. In order to have those resources, we need strong leadership and vision in our rural communities, and a willingness to break down jurisdictional and sectoral boundaries. We get very comfortable within the frameworks we know, but those frameworks are no longer working for us. We need to break those down. And without leadership and those resources, the road ahead is going to be really hard for many rural communities, particularly those with a long history in disinvestment and isolation. How do we get there? There are a number of organizations which are already in this field. We've heard about the CDFIs this morning. They are a really important way of bringing resources, deep local knowledge, combined with access to a broad range of capital from outside. Also, the whole network of regional development organizations which will bring technical assistance and resources, access to government programs and the like. They're there, they're across the country. We don't recognize them well enough and we don't invest in them well enough. But these are not the only ones, but those are two primary types of intermediary organizations out there across rural America which can make a difference. But they require people at the local level to be able to say, the structures we're working within now no longer work for us and we need to change. And I'm not saying the abolition of counties, far from it, but I'm actually saying that counties have to work together and collaborate more around common challenges. Very few of the challenges we talked about this morning can be handled by one jurisdiction alone. It takes a whole bunch of people at different levels to be able to come together. The trick that we have got to find and deal with now is how can we think and act regionally, but at the same time keep our local roots and that we're really embedded in the culture and what's good about rural America. I don't think we know quite what the answer is, but that's what we should be searching for. Because without that combination of good local roots and regional resources and regional viewpoint, we're not going to get to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's vision of healthy communities and equitable access to health and well-being. So is that far enough away from the ground?
I think that's we're levitating. Let me ask you, when you talk about interdependence between urban and rural America, is a lot of it geographic? I mean, for a rural community, is location? Is it better to be close? Is proximity a big factor? What do you think?
Well, I've been buried in this research for quite a while now, and there's quite a strong body of evidence which seems to suggest that counties within sort of commuting distance of a metro area are going to do well, and at certain levels that's true. You can always you can play with these figures to make them what you want, but generally that's true. But the communities which are further away and outside the sort of ambit of these metropolitan centers, they have to figure out how to work together themselves to muster the regional resources. But what I've found in a lot of the discussions I've had is that many of those remote rural areas may actually, particularly if they're farm communities or natural resource, they're already dealing with people across the world.
Yeah.
Right. And they're thinking about markets in China and elsewhere while they're sitting on their tractor. And
absolutely.
so many of these are already thinking about interdependence in a real way. But certainly in the way that I was talking about urban-rural relations, very often that will take place within a context of a commuting zone or whatever.
And I'm curious for everybody on the panel up here, but before we turn to Q&A from the crowd, I spend a lot of time when I'm not doing this, not just this, when I'm not running the American Communities Project, I work for the Wall Street Journal and I work for NBC, and particularly the work that I do for the Wall Street Journal, I spend a lot of time looking at the economy. So for all of you looking at rural America, when we look at what's happening to the economy and how the economy has changed, does it make it harder for these places? I mean, are the challenges different now than they were 20 years ago? Obviously, when we talk about agriculture, Brian's passing the mic. Obviously, when we talk about agriculture, I've spent a lot of time out in those communities, and people will tell you farms getting bigger, you need fewer people, it's been industrialized. But even the decline of small manufacturing and what that's done to some parts of rural America, is it harder now? And are the paths tougher now to find ways to economic growth? Not just in terms of getting money into the community, but to build a sustaining economy in those places. What do you think?
I think that it's always been a challenge for rural communities, just period. In regards to Indian country, and I'll use two quick examples. My grandmother used to say that it took reservations throughout the United States 20 years to realize there was a major depression in the country because they'd been living it. So like kind of caught up in that measure. And most recently, unfortunately, when we had the government shutdown, a lot of individuals within Indian country, that's kind of our life set or somewhat expectations on how money flows in. I think it is more challenging, but in all honesty, I think we have a lot of opportunities that really have not been garnered at this juncture. So I think with the narrative changing and individuals in this room changing this narrative on what rural community or what rural America is, what do rural communities really encompass, and looking at the diversity of rural America just in and of itself, I think is really enlightening, or getting to a point on a national stage. But if you look at a lot of policy endeavors that are meant to invigorate these economies, I don't think that we have fully captured those opportunities. So, for instance, we have opportunity zones now. We've got bond guarantee money, new market tax credits. We could very easily do a small pilot project in a rural community, bringing in tech resources, bringing in, a small corporate component and show how it works and scale that up. So I think with, there's broken systems in which we have to really negate and see what we can do to build those systems up economically for all of America and rural America, which happens to be more equitable. And I think that there's so many movements looking at doing that. But in this day and age, insofar as competition, I think that it's going to be a lot tougher for our rural communities, especially our farmers, and the extractive communities. If we look at Appalachia and what are we doing with coal now, we've got a lot of that going on within Navajo and Hopi country. So while it's a challenge, it can also be viewed, I think, as an extreme opportunity on what can we do to actually change these economies and make them sustainable and equitable, and places where we want to continue to live and not have to tell our children to leave to find a better opportunity. I think more often than not, that's really important to us.
I want to add two additional things and tie it back to the previous session. I think the opportunity around job portability is very real. And that's both job but also business portability. So if we can tackle the broadband question that was raised earlier, I think what we're going to see is the opportunity for young people to come back home, where real estate is much more affordable. So we work in communities where basically the parents say, why aren't my kids coming back where they can have a whole house instead of paying $800 to couch surf in an urban area, right? And I think that's a very real opportunity. The other piece I want to highlight, because it's been there all along, but I don't think we've put enough focus or light on it, is the amazing entrepreneurial spirit in rural. And I can only speak for the 7 states in the South where we work, but it's always impressive to me that when you open that opportunity and you create that support mechanism, all of a sudden seeing the entrepreneurs show up. So in Dermot, Arkansas, which some folks at Robert Wood Johnson might know intimately from last summer's visit, we're building that leadership team, and when we ask the leadership team, we're going to bring a management consultant in our capital land. if you could organize a group of interested entrepreneurs, and in this small town of less than 1,000 people, here were 8 entrepreneurs with viable business ideas that just showed up. I don't think 2 years ago or 3 years ago that community would have had that thought or had really that instinct to say, wow, we've got a lot of entrepreneurial spirit here.
I can't resist.
Taking back to the Wall Street Journal, Dante. So we're going to plant this. There just is a narrative that rising tides still lift all
Right,
Americans.
exactly,
And
yes.
I watch the same curves of the recovery. And when we have the chair of the Federal Reserve Board admit, as he did at the Housing Assistance Council's event in December, that the recovery is uneven, or as he did when he came to the Mississippi Delta, where Ed and his colleagues hosted him in the middle of Itabena, Mississippi, that not all Americans enjoy the same access.
Yeah.
That's the challenge of the, is it getting better, is it getting worse?
Yep.
A framing. This is such an incredible country of wealth and opportunity, and we do see boats lift, and some of those boats do rise
Yep.
in rural America. This is not a great moment for a lot of American agriculture, but it has gone in cycles. What is, I'll steal Inez's, there are some areas that seem to be, as Chrystel just said it, recession-proof. I mean, they don't
Yes.
seem to affect. So I would push us to continue, get those colleagues at the Wall Street Journal who do their little graphs, to focus on the parts which have been persistently poor. And it is going to take more than Lisa's merry band of CDFIs. I do admit that we can't do it all by ourselves. It would be great to have a Medicare expansion and the big tools that lift communities. But I think it does take an extra push if we want to move those economies, and that's where we seem to be positioned for the
Yeah.
partnership. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not here to bury or defend the Wall Street Journal. I work for the Wall Street Journal. But one of the things, and I know people in this room may have very mixed feelings about, politics or whatnot. But the one thing that's really come out of politics, I think, in the last couple of years, is an understanding that the economy is uneven, and how uneven growth has been. I grew up outside Detroit, and I'll tell you right now, it's been uneven for a really long time, because when the country's done well, the people that I grew up with weren't doing very well. So the idea that people's eyes are suddenly open to this, I think, is actually a real plus. In some ways, the real positive that's come out of kind of the turbulence in the country right now is an understanding that it's not spread very evenly. And with that, let's go to the audience and any questions for this distinguished panel. People over here.
I just wanted to ask, with the important role that CDFIs are playing to fill the gaps that banks are leaving, how much bank investment are you able to leverage into your CDFIs that help do the important lending that you're doing?
Thanks for the question about leverage, because we don't go by ourselves. That too is uneven. Our stat that we take to the bank is that for every dollar a CDFI has, we grab 12 more dollars of investment. And Jim King of Fahy will tell you it's more like 20 or even higher, and it's higher in other areas. So we're almost always leveraging other dollars. The stat that Ed showed this morning, though, is that they don't have to. So because the CRA law, which is so critical for bringing bank investments to where their deposits are, it's uneven. The banks are not resident in rural America. They don't have an obligation. So that has been responsible for an unevenness, again, pretty significant unevenness around those leverage numbers, what we've been able to do. But the truth is, none of us are lending by ourselves, and the magnitude of when you bring a CDFI dollar, we're often in the same deal as a bank. They are just taking, frankly, more juicy position, if you're a lender, and a position where they're more secured, or where we're taking more risk in the in the deal to make it work. So we have more flexible standards, and our investors, thank you foundations, have been more patient with us and put that kind of equity capital in us that allows us to take that risk. But the leverage is serious, and it's at a minimum of 12 to 1, and I'm sure my colleagues could even tout more.
I could say on behalf of Indian country, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of bank partnerships or have the ability to capitalize our CDFIs in particular with banks. For several reasons. Oweesta, we've been lucky to have maybe 2 or 3 pretty hefty conventional bankers banks that have supported us. CRA is a huge obstacle. For those of you that don't know, CRA, Community Reinvestment Act, so basically a bank gives a certain amount of their profits to underserved communities, to nonprofits, to kind of help with community development initiatives that they find within their target market. So being Indian country has been out of those markets, we haven't really seen that. Typically, I find our greatest investors tend to be foundations, religious organizations, and private individuals. So in regards to Native communities, we have a long way to really start holding hands with conventional banking institutions to be able to leverage additional funds.
Questions?
I am with the National 4-H Council, and when we talk about equity, a lot of our work funded by our Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, so thank you. But when we talk about equity, we talk about equity, access, and belonging. And it's been a pleasure being here, hearing about solutions, all the panelists talking about creating more equity and access. But when I think about belonging, I think of that as sort of that missing piece for the longevity of solutions. Mental health solutions. And I'm also a member of the United Tribe of Indians of Wisconsin. So I guess for Chrystel, my question or maybe prompt is, I think that's one of the power of tribal communities is that using culture and community as a tool for healing and recovery. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and any applicability there might be for other rural communities in America for using that belonging aspect to create healthier outcomes for people.
That's an interesting question. One thing that I find really interesting, and I work within my preview of my job all over Indian country. On a private level, I powwow a lot, so I'm all over rural America in that regard. And one thing that I think is really beautiful about rural communities in and of itself is we still take care of each other, particularly within Native communities. We still have that communal aspect of living and giving and never really have been geared towards that individualistic aspect, regardless of years of assimilation practices or government policies that somewhat tried to force us in this measure. So in looking at that, aspect of healing and community through culture, every rural community that I've been to, and this isn't replicative all of Indian country, has their own culture. And I think that that's a really beautiful aspect, and it's such diverse cultures. One thing that we're really trying to change the narrative of is the diversity of rural America, and just in regards to size, in regards to economic mobility, in regards to race, and so many other factors. I think one thing that, a cultural moray may be that natives hold that rural communities somewhat could find parallel or beneficial really is to look at your most vulnerable and take care of those first. And what do you need to do within your economic paradigm to do so? So in looking at, housing is always a crisis, children, elders. So in taking care and lifting up the most marginalized, we find strength in that. And I think that's something that can be, cross-culturally referenced, but I think in their own aspects, rural communities do that anyway. I think about many reservations, you'll be hard-pressed to find somebody homeless. They might be a pain, but they'll couch surf. I'll keep you for 5 days, and you're going here for 5 days, or, hunger. People with little actually give more.
You see that throughout rural America. I mean, that is something, the homeless problem, such as it is. You're right. Maybe different way of putting it being a pain, but yeah. Absolutely.
Hi, Ursula Bauer with Department of Health and Human Services. So I was lucky enough to be in Massachusetts over the weekend for my daughter's college graduation, and a headline in the Boston Globe read, "Electricity comes to the Navajo Nation." Of course, electricity got to the Navajo Nation a very long time ago, but the article was making the point that there are 60,000 homes on Navajo without electricity. And given the current pace, it would take us 35 years to reach those homes. And by the way, this weekend was 2019, not 1919. So given the discussion that you just had about taking care of the most vulnerable, and the previous discussion we had sort of around values in rural communities, taking care of each other, how do we as a nation embrace that value? I think at some level we like to think we have that value of taking care of all of us, but in the infrastructure bill that apparently is being developed, we're not necessarily talking about rural electrification or rural broadband. We're talking about crumbling bridges and highways. So how do we change that narrative in terms of how we, the people, can really ensure that we are taking care of the nation? And that's reflected in how we choose to spend our tax dollars and how we choose to invest more evenly in our communities.
Not a lot of time. I'll say quickly, though, it's coming down. The one thing I would say that's very important for us to do that is to understand, again, people misunderstand what rural America is. And I think one of the first things we have to do is get a better understanding of people of just how complex the landscape is. The simple answers are nice, I mean, because the answers are easy. But, in reality, things are complicated. And I think explaining the full level of complication and how people struggle in rural America and what the struggles look like and feel like, that's an important step. And we're running out of time, but Brian.
I just want to say one thing which we haven't talked about, and that's the question of power. One of the reasons why rural America doesn't get the resources it needs is because it's not really at any of the tables where those decisions about resources are made. So this gets back to my hobby horse about rural and urban have to be together at the table with equal voice and equal power in order to get rid of those sorts of injustices that you've described in terms of just basic infrastructure. That's inexcusable. And we're not a nation which, well, we go through the motions of putting our arms around and saying we care for each other, but that's not the reality in the way the large-scale resources are allocated. It's who's got the power. And until we sort of redistribute that power, then we've got to sort of put a Band-Aid over it and deal with it at the local level and take care of ourselves within that unfair context. So I really don't want us to forget this power as being an important part of this discussion.
That's we got to cut it. We got to cut it there. We got to cut it. We got to cut it there. We've been told. Honestly, that's a really nice, I think, just realistic note to end everything. And thank you for this panel. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Robert Wood Johnson. I have been told to tell you that you cannot leave. We're transitioning to something new, but I'm supposed to have everybody stand up, stretch, don't hit people near you, move, and we'll have the next people come up to lead the